Michael Ostrolenk here. I'm with Ryan Frisinger. He's a biohacker, techno-shaman, and visionary. His main focus of research is the interaction between genetics, biotechnology, medicine culture, and the humanities. With an emphasis on biohacking, Ryan designs customized health programs that address genetic weaknesses, nutritional deficiencies, emotional traumas, and performance issues. By transforming advanced multidisciplinary research into potent health restoring programs, he provides individuals with an operating manual for their unique body. His client base includes professional athletes, high performers, autistic children, and individuals with autoimmune diseases, neurological disorders, and other chronic illnesses. And he's also my coach of sorts. Good to see you, Ryan.
Nice to see you, Michael.
So, tell us a little bit about yourself. What led you to become a visionary techno-shaman biohacker?
So it probably started, early on in life. My grandmother was a nurse and also pretty hardcore feminist and civil rights activist, and kind of was the person that really started to introduce me to health ideas, alternative health, and then sort of the relationships that we have with the larger world. And so I was kind of steeped in that from, around 6 or 7 years old, really starting to get exposed to medical knowledges and spending time in the hospitals where my grandmother worked, and then being exposed early on with my own healthcare to homeopathy and acupuncture. And so I had a pretty vested interest in medicine from a very early age. Also had, my mother and I were hit by a drunk driver when I was 4.5 years old, and so that kind of exposed me to also the sort of larger Western medical paradigm. My mom had a head injury, and it was at a time when not a lot was known about how to treat head injuries. And so growing up alongside that, I had to kind of grow up quickly, but was always sort of a problem solver, very creative kid, very interested in learning about things, but really learning about things to solve problems, so designing solutions. And so I studied everything from medicine to architecture, and kind of had a very interdisciplinary upbringing in the way that I pursued knowledge. Currently, I have one of my cousins just finished medical school. He's a radiologist at UC San Diego. Another cousin just finished a doctorate as a nurse practitioner in Dallas. And so medicine is in our family for sure. I actually went and pursued PhD work in the humanities and comparative literature, and did a lot of cultural studies work, and studied at first what was called critical animal studies. Wrote a master's thesis on industrial animal agriculture and kind of the ways in which state institutions process non-human entities through language to make them consumable, and kind of use that also to kind of look at the Bush administration's war on terror and that kind of things, and looked at how the metaphors of industrial animal agriculture were actually being used also by political institutions at that time to deal with kind of enemy combatants and other non-human sort of things, and so looked at the rhetorics employed in those pursuits. So I was really doing a lot of critical theory work, post-humanism, kind of doing a lot of research on sustainability. I was doing my PhD at the University of Southern California in Los Angeles, and I was also a fellow in the Center for Sustainable Cities. And so I was doing a lot of thinking about how humans had to conceptualize their identity in order to respond to the ecological crises that are kind of a big part of our world right now. And so it was very theoretical, and had a bit of an activist kind of background. And then at age 30, I traveled to the Amazon to do dissertation research, lived down there for nearly a year, came back to Los Angeles, and then got really sick. And that's really what returned me back into the medical field, was my own health. 2 years very, very sick in bed, and no one knew what was wrong with me. I saw the best doctors, and no one could really figure out what was going on, and that led me to try to fix myself. And I took my research skills, became an expert in genetics, especially methylation and mitochondrial genetics, and found out that I didn't have very good genetics. And after a period of time of environmental exposures, I had a physical breakdown. My genome actually collapsed, and I had a very unfavorable kind of 4 or 5 year health crisis that it took some amount of effort to get out of, but the way that I got out of it was addressing my genetic weaknesses and then using some of the tools of what we would call functional medicine and a lot of tools dealing with stress, meditation, kind of a whole human, whole body method of bringing myself back to health. And so in the process of helping myself, I became able to help other people and really recommitted to the kind of medical path that I probably should have gotten back onto when I was in my early 20s. I had been admitted to medical school and also naturopathy programs and always sort of skewed away from it and went towards the humanities, but now I'm kind of back square with that. And so that's what I do every day is think about genetics, the implications of it, and then really how to figure out simple fixes for the genetic problems that I see that are starting to show up increasingly because there's so much toxicity in the environment right now that the genome is really starting to collapse a bit under it. And so I'm seeing a lot of patterns, especially with people that live in big cities in the U.S., a lot of patterns of how the genes are breaking down. And so I'm really thinking about that, but I'm also thinking about how do we make sense of this information, because genetics can be incredibly convoluted. The way that it's studied is not necessarily translatable to a clinical setting. And so that's kind of really where I'm at right now. And my current research is on mostly mitochondrial restoration and mitochondria, but also on trying to figure out how to restore telomere function or telomere function so that the person doesn't age as quickly and so that there's better cell turnover and, trying to put the brakes on a lot of the degenerative stuff that goes on in the body. So that's kind of a snapshot. There's a lot of detours we could take there, but hopefully that can lead us into talking a little more deeply about particular things today.
Certainly. And I need to do a shout out to Danielle, who's a mutual friend who introduced us and got me working with you. It's been fascinating working with you because, I sent you my genetic information from 23andMe, and you asked me like 300 million questions from, like birth, vaginal versus C-section all the way up to the present time. So you obviously come from a very holistic perspective, which is fantastic because that's where I'm coming from, my interests and such. So you're integrating like the best of all the different worlds that I see you playing in. Presently, this is the late winter of 2017. Debate policy-wise here in Washington D.C. Ryan is Trump care versus Obamacare, and in my mind, it's a conversation or a debate around the allocation of resources in a sick care system. Who pays for what? Who controls what decisions? And I've heard very little, if anything, at all around health, especially optimizing health. And it seems to me that you're on the cutting edge of optimizing health, and one of your interests is how do you take this information, genetic information, which is now available to anyone. It's pretty inexpensive to most people. It's pretty inexpensive to get your DNA test through 23andMe or Ancestry.com or one of these other sources, and then send it to an expert like you. Talk to me about, let's talk about the biopolitics of where the system is presently today in terms of the sick care system and the system that you are presently helping to generate through your work and the path there.
Sure. I mean, it's a big topic, and we'll definitely kind of work to unpack that right now. So just sort of to give some context in terms of genetic testing's been around really popularly probably since the early 90s. And in the mid-2000s, a lot of Silicon Valley firms started to see that this was the future of medicine. And so there was a lot of VC funding, and companies like 23andMe in their early formation started to appear around 2006, 2007. And these tests, when they first came on the market, were about $750,000. Here in 2017, 23andMe now, with the Ancestry-only raw data option, is $99. So the cost of the information to understand what's going on at the chemical level in your body and at the blueprint level of your body has become very cheap. And this is a movement that you've seen in software, the idea of open source technology, the idea that information should be free. This is sort of an offshoot of that. At some point, genetic testing will probably occur at birth, and there's going to be a lot of issues about how we deal with that ethically. I'm not sure we want to end up in a situation like the movie Gattaca, where you have genetic information determining social opportunities and trajectories. But in the context of a current system where you're not only fighting to have some sort of insurance coverage, and then you're hoping to extrapolate through that coverage some sort of way to maintain your health. And most of Western medicine, and it's a very simple critique, but unfortunately it's true, is about symptom management. And it usually is something that starts to become important in around 40 to 45 years old, when body systems start to break down and you start to see age-related illnesses. And those can range from fibromyalgia to simple brain fog all the way to really serious things like Parkinson's disease and cancer. And we're seeing really high rates of this. But unfortunately, because of the complexity of most modern illnesses, the coverage and the primary care visits that you typically would be offered through any type of universal healthcare coverage are going to afford you about 15 minutes with a physician. They may or may not look at anything, maybe a few small labs that are not super specified to the genetic or phenotype, and then you're sort of sent home with a pharmacological intervention. That's usually the extent of it. And so when we talk about biopolitics, I mean, biopolitics is largely concerned, and biopolitics is a large field, but it's largely concerned with the way in which states and governments govern the bodies of the populace, and what sorts of medical interventions, what sorts of labeling occur. And even when you get down to the types of things that are billable to insurance, there's a certain politics around those definitions, around what physicians can receive. And modern medicine currently is not a results-oriented system, so you can essentially treat patients endlessly without any real health resolutions and still get insurance reimbursement. That is going to change soon. There's a lot of talk around insurance that it's going to move towards results-oriented reimbursement. And so there's a lot of physicians that I'm personally friends with that are struggling to keep practices afloat because insurance is now only reimbursing about 80% of what Medicare will pay. And previously that wasn't an issue, but the bigger issue is whether or not the healthcare system itself has the knowledge, has the will, and has the interest in actually treating people and working with people at the level of their humanity, and actually shows some sort of potential for dealing with the rising and alarming rising rates of modern illnesses that we're starting to see that don't have a single cause. They're multifactorial by nature. And so when we get back to the work that I attempt to do, I look at everything. So I'm not a genetic determinist. There's something called epigenetics, and epigenetics are the means by which we override some of our genetic inheritance. And it's the way in which our genome interacts with the environment. And so there's a lot of consciousness and there's a lot of learning to be done to learn how to take advantage of epigenetics to pull ourselves out of these situations. And some really simple examples of epigenetics are diet. You know, how do we eat? What is the right sort of diet that we should be following? And when you start to talk about biopolitics, again, most modern diets, most nutritional schools are usually following curriculum that's sponsored by corporate interests. A lot of the USDA food pyramid, for example, came out and was created in the 70s, the early 70s, when there was a war between whether or not it was sort of fat or sugar that caused modern illnesses. The person who believed that it was high fat, high cholesterol issues won out. The food pyramid got constructed as a carbohydrate dense, high sugar sort of thing, in which in the 90s we started to add synthetic nutrients to that. And so that's how most of our modern eating paradigms are designed, and they follow that sort of stuff. And we know that we know very clearly now that our modern food pyramid actually antagonizes our genetics. Our genetics are not designed to operate with that sort of fuel. And so there's a lot of learning and a lot of seeking and searching that unfortunately people have to go through just to figure out how to eat on the one hand. And when a person figures out how to properly eat and support their genetic expression properly, and how to deal with their body composition and how to balance blood sugar and all the sort of balancing acts that the body has to provide through the nutrition that you give it, then you have one sort of layer of learning that allows a person to take advantage of of how they're going to reproduce themselves in time in a healthy way or restore themselves if their health has gone off the rails. But a lot of this learning is left, to the person themselves. There's not a great curriculum. There's no real single source for this. And so when you talk about Obamacare or Trump care and whatever we're going to end up with once these debates are settled in the government, we're still not settling this issue. We still haven't answered the question of how do we eat on a daily basis? How much water should we drink? Is our water clean enough? These very simple inputs that help to maintain our health. We're not really going to solve those issues just by administering healthcare coverage. Because the physicians themselves that are administering your coverage and treating you don't actually have this training either. And so that's one layer of it. And then when you talk about this idea of how much do we know about ourselves, we spend a lot of time developing our personality, our interests, trying to figure out what it is we're going to do with ourselves as we age, how we're going to educate ourselves. But we actually don't have a lot of insights into how this vehicle, our body, is functioning. And so that's where genetics comes in. If you learn how to eat properly and you learn how to hydrate yourself in ways that support your health and the maintenance of your body systems, then you can bring in genetics to see where your weak links are, where you may be weakened in response to certain types of environmental factors. Stress is probably the number one affecting force on the genetics of our body. And so how do you deal with stress in your day-to-day life in an increasingly stressful world? But once you have that genetic information, as of now, we believe the genetics don't change. They're seen as fixed, but epigenetics allows you to override that a little bit. But once you have that information of how to eat, how to hydrate yourself, and then you have genetics, you will then at that point have a really good idea of how to supplement, how to bring things online that can help to maintain your health, that can help prevent disease processes from starting, can help to reverse some of those processes. And in my mind, doing all of that is a form of sort of self-knowing and personal development that maybe is not privileged right now in our country. It's probably not privileged in many places, but I think it's as integral to going to college and getting your education and thinking about it, that knowledge of the body and the self, but knowledge that's not politically defined, knowledge that has some science basis. And there's plenty of people that will fight me. I'm not an empiricist by nature, but they're having some degree of scientific validity for the information that you're using matters, but also applying that information to self and seeing how it hangs or sticks is also just as important. But in my mind, there's nothing more important than getting your body supported, and doing so right now is not an easy task. There's thousands of books out there on diet alone. There's hundreds that come out on a monthly basis. And so navigating that kind of prismatic notion of diet and prismatic notion of how you should protect your genes and how you should supplement and how much sunlight to get. And so there's a lot of sort of tidbits of information that I think show up in increasingly random ways these days that are fairly easy to organize. At the end of the day, the body is very simple and requires a simple set of inputs. If you have health problems, there's a certain set of things that have to be specified for those to help your unique phenotype heal and reverse whatever conditions are present. But at the end of the day, it's really not that complex. And so a lot of my work is really trying to sift through the mountain of information that we have and to find that needle in the haystack that's actually useful and applicable to a large number of people, that does very little harm, sort of adhering to the old Greek ideals of medicine, do no harm, using food as medicine, and really not trying to outsmart our body and not trying to override its intelligence. And so that's what a lot of my work is, and a lot of that is sorting politically through ideas to find out where the connections are, and it's a bit like what Joseph Campbell did with human myths. Medical knowledge has a prismatic appearance, but oftentimes when you sift down far enough, you start to see the similarities of ideas. And when you start to see that, you start to find information that's usable and that can actually do something to the physical body. And so that's kind of what a lot of my work is dealing with. And now that we have genetics, like I said, genetics offer each person that has that test an incredibly clear glimpse at what's going on at the molecular level of their systems. And so I find this information to be incredibly liberating. and incredibly empowering because it allows you to advocate when you are in the healthcare system for yourself and for the right kinds of tests. It allows you to advocate and understand whether or not you should take certain types of medications or not. And so something that Michael and I chatted about briefly before we came on air here is that the 4 most prescribed drugs right now are quinolone, antibiotics, antidepressants, statin drugs, and well, it's really a couple of classes of statin drugs. And all of these drugs are incredibly toxic to the mitochondria. And so there's something right now called pharmacogenetic testing that we're running, and that basically tells us how do we enzymatically process certain kinds of prescription drugs. Are we fast metabolizers? Will those drugs do anything for us if we take them? But even that testing doesn't tell us whether or not, it's healthy for us to take it. But these drugs are prescribed to probably a third to a half of the American population right now that's of the age to have problems with their health. And these drugs basically undermine the energetic basis of the body, which is the organelles, what I'm terming the mitochondria that live in every single cell in the body. And so these are things that I think are important, and this isn't to open up conspiracies about what's going on. It's just to say that our medical interventions or practices, they happen to be funded mostly by corporate interests because that's who's funding research at the university level. And that's really not to point blame, but it's to say that the information's imperfect. And so arming yourself with some very simple pieces of information allows you to figure out what your body needs to move forward in a healthy way. And oftentimes the natural therapies trump any of the pharmaceutical interventions and their effectiveness. And they also happen to be preferable on many levels because they're not toxic to your system. So that's sort of a snapshot. There's a lot to kind of get in there, and I may have danced around a little bit, but it's a very complex apparatus of ideas that we're talking about, especially around national healthcare coverage and then what that actually looks like boiled down to an everyday person's experience of the healthcare industry. And I'm not sure that, anybody's actually talking about this in ways that are meaningful at the moment.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. It's just who spends what, where, when, and how in a secure system. Yeah, you mentioned doctors quite a few times, and it was interesting because I took the information you provided me and I gave it to one of my doctors who I really like and have a lot of respect for. But he was like, I don't understand genetics. He can't do anything with it. He thought it was interesting because you spelled some things out, but he didn't know anything about it really. And I think that's probably pretty common with 99% of all medically trained doctors. And so how do we go from doctors who don't even understand kind of the basis of the blueprints that help generate us to helping them to understand that, so then they can provide intervention or suggest interventions that are, work less toxic all the way up to maybe bio-individualized, so they might still be somewhat toxic, but they still work. I mean, depending on where you're at, what you need, all that kind of good stuff, but based on the individual. Now, from what you just said, with more than half the American public using one of those, 2 of those, 3 of those, 4 of those or those categories of drugs, it just seems like doctors just spread the drugs out without even recognizing the dangers of them, let alone the bio-individuality and other ways that are less toxic and more supporting of the biological systems to support health. How do you go from that system to what you do? And let me phrase a specific question. When you talk to doctors, because you do, what are their responses and how do they take your information?
So I'll start with that question first, and then I'll go into answering kind of how do we get from where we are to where we need to be. Most doctors that I speak to, if they're open-minded and already have a functional mindset, they're open to the information but skeptical, largely because a lot of the ideas around these genetic single nucleotide polymorphisms that we're operating off of, the research is less than 4 and 5 years old. Some of the mitochondrial research that I'm doing right now is the publications haven't even been out for 6 months. And so one of the ways, so I've met with a lot of skepticism. There's a lot of ways in which as well, I don't have a medical degree. I'm very confident in my ability as a researcher to understand medicine, and I get results with my clients. But there's a way in which there's and I'm going to borrow a phrase from a book called The Sexual Politics of Meat by Carol Adams. And she has a very profound line in that book, which is, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And so I'm using that in the sense, sometimes when talking and speaking to doctors, because I'm not an MD, I'm not really given a fair shake sometimes to even talk to them. They look at me as not being one of them. The ones that are open-minded, actually, I consult for and I do work for them. But I think, unfortunately, a lot of what's happening, functional medicine is an attempt at the Western paradigm to kind of borrow some of the practices of naturopathy and to use more natural therapies. But unfortunately, a lot of these doctors are going to some weekend workshops and they try to employ functional procedures, but they're still fighting their own training. Mm-hmm. And genetics as well. The way in which the sort of divide between research and clinical practice, the gulf between those two poles is huge. And so a lot of the people that are really versed in genetics, for instance, are laboratory researchers, and they have no idea how to apply that knowledge meaningfully to human bodies. And a lot of this knowledge that we're working from is being derived from animal studies, which there's been a debate for decades about whether or not those can be meaningfully extrapolated to human beings. Most of them are done on small mammals. And so doctors that are open-minded, I think, are very open to understanding genetics, and they prefer to be trained in that sense by someone else, or they'll bring in somebody in a consultancy role. And so my role with a lot of those doctors is to read the genetics, sort of lay out what the person needs in terms of supplementation and dietary change, and then they'll kind of handle some of the functional lab assessments. And so it's more of a team effort than a doctor actually going and synthesizing that information into their own practice. Then there are doctors that will flat out say that it's all unsettled science and that it's meaningless. And there's even doctors that understand genetics that will talk about certain mutations that are problematic and dismissive of the results around those because they're very hard to treat clinically. Because one of the major issues also to talk about sort of the doctor's issue is medicine is a practice, and I don't know if patients understand that. Most people take medicine to be a solidified field of knowledge where I go in, I have this, the doctor gives me this, it's fixed. Unfortunately, through my own experience, I learned that medicine is a practice, and so most doctors do the best they can with the information they had. But a lot of this, I mean, the phenotypical experience of any health intervention is very unique to the person. And so this idea of citizen science and the quantified self movement and biohacking, I think, is a really important response, or a bridge building response to get from sort of traditional Western medicine to bio-individualized care that has genetic basis to it. I think that's sort of a bridge, because the more N=1 data that we can get, and the more people are willing to try out things that are not harmful to their system to try to fix certain health problems, I think the quicker we're going to be able to get there. But I definitely, feel for a lot of doctors, the ones that are open-minded, because they have usually 15 to 30 minutes to spend with a patient if they're insurance taking physicians, and then they aren't really given the tools in medical school to understand these things. And so and generally doctors, unless they're MD, PhDs, which there are a fair amount of them, they're not really versed in research. And so there'll be specialists, but oftentimes, a doctor's inability to fix an issue really comes from them being too specialized. And so to kind of get to the bigger issue, there's been a movement in the academic world for probably 30 years now, but really concerted efforts in the last 10 towards interdisciplinary research. And usually it's more of a sort of platitude that's spoken about in conferences, and people end up holing up in their disciplinary caves and not really wanting to do it because there's a lot of ego involved and people don't want to admit that they can't speak languages. But the only reason why I'm semi-successful at what I do, or more successful than most of the physicians that my patients have seen, is because I am an interdisciplinary researcher. And because interdisciplinarity has a major advantage over specialization when dealing with the human body. And so a lot of times, I feel that if doctors were trained not just to think across the medical terrain and the medical disciplines, and given more opportunity in those realms to kind of get exposure and cross-pollination, but that they did learn how to do something like literary analysis, for instance, which allows you to make sense of labs and patient histories with more understanding and depth, and it allows you to ask better questions. So in my mind, sort of a return to the physicians of the Greek and Roman era in our Western paradigm, or in the Eastern and Chinese Ayurvedic traditions where everything about the person matters. You're taught about the emotions of the person. You're taught about the lineal inheritances. You think about that human in a nested reality of experience. I think that would allow physicians to do more of that, and I think a lot of that would probably have to come not in medical school, but in sort of post-medical training. Mm-hmm. And I think that in terms of bridge building, the idea of biohacking and the idea of medical hermeneutics and some of these things could be offered as more continuing education kind of things. And more interdisciplinarity, where you actually had teams of doctors. And so you're seeing movements, what we're calling boutique medicine, where you go and unfortunately these particular treatments are normally only available to very high net worth people because they're expensive, but concierge medicine, mm-hmm. where you can go in and have bioidentical hormone replacement and have labs and have a nutritionist talk to you, and it's all in-house. But most of those consultations are between $3,000 and $5,000 for your initial consultation, all out of pocket. So for me, I'm not a cynic. I'm a fairly optimistic person, but I think that we have a lot of obstacles to overcome to move us from the sort of Western pharmacological perspective on health and how to restore health to a more holistic, integrated concern for the patient's entirety of experience. And there's a lot of medicines and things from herbs to homeopathic remedies, which, what most Western doctors think are snake oil. They don't believe they work. And these are the very epigenetic modifiers and chemical sort of interventions that you can make that are safe, that are some of the things that are the only possible interventions that move the needle in some disease states. And so, I'd like to say that we're going to be able to get there, but I don't know. I think that what's going to allow us to get there is people that are not medically trained coming in and starting to learn how to do medicine. So this movement of citizen science, biohacking, you're going to see more and more of it, not just on the medical side. Most of it right now is in the creation of home lab tests for certain kinds of pathogenic diseases that are mostly aimed towards third world implementation. But you're seeing a lot of rapid innovation in medicine and treatments vis-a-vis this citizen science approach that's being employed. And just to give you an example, in the paleo world, there's a guy named Art Devaney who was one of the first people to talk about low carbohydrate diets, low carbohydrate, high fat diets. Art Devaney's foray into diet came because he had a son with type 1 diabetes, and they wanted to learn how to control this with more natural interventions. Art Devaney is a PhD economist at UCLA. He's now an emeritus professor. He modeled his understanding of insulin after decentralized economies and economics, and that metaphor works because the body absolutely is a decentralized economy. And so you had this really amazing book that came online that Art put out back in the early 2000s. It was one of the first sort of paleo templates out there that did a lot of good. Then fast forward, there's a couple, Paul Jaminet is more well known of the couple who wrote The Perfect Health Diet. They're both astrophysicists from Harvard, but in my mind, they wrote the best book I've ever read on human diet, which is called The Perfect Health Diet. They sifted through research from all different disciplines and were able to compile it and get a really clear picture. And so I'm saying this because I think the physicians of the future are not physicians. They're going to end up being the kid that studied literature or the kid that studied art or finance or whatever, that then took a different lens to a medical issue and then figured out a treatment. So Marcel Proust has this famous line, bringing new eyes so that you can see things differently. Mm-hmm. And that's the role of sort of analysis and interpretation, is for us to be able to look at the same thing in a new light in order to advance the paradigm itself. And so I also think, academically speaking, if you're going to start to see more history of science and history of medicine programs popping up. Most elite universities, Stanford probably has the best history of science program, but the internal critiques of the practice and of the knowledge basis and all of that, I think, are going to be very big parts of this sort of movement away from kind of what I would call this kind of pharmacological medicine towards holistic medicine that's practiced at large, not just in small pockets by naturopaths and acupuncturists and NDs. And I think it's going to be that internal critique of the paradigm that's really going to help move medicine and medical schools forward. And I'm not sure they do a lot of philosophy work in those departments. And so one of the reasons why I left academia is precisely because of a lot of these problems, because a lot of your research also, this is a quick point I want to make, citational work is sort of the bedrock of academic knowledge. So you're really hard-pressed to do any sort of research unless you've got a citational basis and history for that research. And unfortunately, a lot of these modern illnesses that are popping up, if we're moving back into the medical terrain, don't have that citational basis. Or there's not funding to acquire that citational basis through studies. And so I think, again, a lot of my work on biopolitics and open source ideas and sort of the idea that information should be free comes from an impetus that says that I know that the only way we're going to get good data about how to treat the human body is by freeing the ability to pursue the research and opening it to more disciplines and opening it to more audiences, and also giving patients enough of a self-education that they understand how to employ things on themselves. Because at the end of the day, as a practitioner who works with mostly people who are extremely sick, I can't do anything other than provide a guide. That person carries the torch. They have to eat the food that they're supposed to eat. They have to take their supplements. They have to be mindful in reporting what's going on, and they have to be patient with the transformation in the body. The patient does all of that. And so I also think that that's another big piece about medicine, is the doctor seeing themselves not so much as a proselytizing or professorial presence, but more as a guide who's learning just as much from the patient as the patient's learning from the doctor. And that's, again, why I'm returning to medical hermeneutics so much, because when you are inquiring or interpreting text, as the interpreter, those texts work on you in reverse. And so when I work with my clients, I learn just as much from them. And it's necessary that I learn just as much, because we both have to evolve towards an understanding of the problem. And it doesn't come from the top down. I have a lot of forays and knowledge that allow us to get into the situation and understand it, but really the unfolding of the solution, or the solution to the problem, comes from that cooperative effort between patient and doctor, practitioner and client. And so that's sort of a big thing that I see really missing from the practice of medicine. The doctor usually does not listen to their patient, and dismisses a lot of obvious clinical signs. Mm-hmm. And so I've seen this a lot, especially with women in cancer presentations, uterine cancer, things of that nature. I've had several female clients that have been repeatedly dismissed, and then, they've basically been moving from stage 1 to stage 4 of various types of cancer because their reported feedback to their doctors has been ignored as not being clinically valuable. And so it's a huge problem. It's a philosophical problem. It's a personal problem. It's a psychological problem. I think, again, for me, educating the patient and working more at the level of the individual and trying to give individuals the tools to understand medicine is a faster vehicle or faster path to getting towards a more sane healthcare scenario than trying to train doctors in medical institutions.
Makes
That's
sense.
my perspective.
Yeah.
It's also admittedly self-serving because I'm not coming from those institutions. Mm-hmm. So I'm carving out a sort of rhetoric for myself as well that I'm transparent about. But I just know that, like, the revolution of medicine and the medical school itself has not happened. And it's a bit like Thomas Kuhn's structure and function of scientific revolutions. Medicine is probably one of the slowest moving disciplines in all of academia, and very slow at responding to innovation. Mm-hmm. And so, I think that it's going to be forced in that way because our ability to treat chronic diseases is very poor. We're not very successful at it. And so I think that, and then once insurance stops reimbursing doctors when they get no results, it's going to push the discipline. But unfortunately, those are economic movers. And so I think that there's some movement there to be able to do that. But, this is it's a huge topic, and we could talk about every sort of aspect of the apparatus of medicine and how it functions and what areas would need to be remediated or altered to have a more healthy system. It's probably out of the scope of this particular conversation, but I think there's fundamental problems in all of the pillars of medicine that are making us not as effective as we could be at dealing with the things that we're starting to see right now show up medically.
So let me ask you this with our last remaining minutes for this part of the conversation. We've already talked to be coming back for part 2 and 3 and 4, because there are a lot of things that you and I have talked about offline that I want to have a broader audience listen to you talk about. But can you walk through how you actually work with a client?
Sure. So a 23andMe test is not necessary for what I do, but I encourage my clients to bring that because it's going to make everything that we do more focused. So I essentially, when I take on a new client, and and I should say who my client base is really quickly, I mostly work with individuals that have seen 30 plus doctors, very complex chronic illness cases, and a handful of professional athletes. I'm starting to work more on optimization cases, and I'm starting to work with a lot of younger children because I'm seeing 5 and 10-year-old kids with problems that I see in 40 and 50-year-old adults now, especially with cognition issues. And so a person comes to me, I typically want to look at any laboratory results that they've had. I give them my own set of questionnaires, which includes, which you've been through, Michael, a functional assessment of the body systems. That's a scoring system self-reported by the client. I give them a neurotransmitter assessment to see what the dominant neurotransmitter type is of that person and how to support and balance the sort of dominant neurotransmitters. And then I'm now asking people to construct health timelines that start from, the mother's conception all the way through to their current age, and to give me significant events, traumas, illnesses, whatever that they feel is important. And that becomes a major guide in how we kind of start the treatments that the person needs to kind of work on their issues. Genetics absolutely inform what I do. I look at 600 individual single nucleotide polymorphisms that are available through the 23andMe raw data. And those genetic sets cover methylation, mitochondria, the thyroid, the immune system, all the allergy pathways, the transsulfuration pathways. So most of the major biochemical processes in the body I'm getting a glimpse at. And so once we have all that data assembled, I get lab data, then I kind of try to make sense and get a good idea for what the dominant pathologies and dominant issues are, and then we move from there. And when a person works with me, they're going to be asked to change their diet almost always, unless they're already eating really well. And they're going to be sequenced on a set of supplements that deal with their issues from a hierarchy that is determined from what I see in their labs and their other questionnaires, but also their genetic priorities. And the process, depending on the level of the health of the person, can take from 1 to 3 years, because I work all the way from the foundations of the nutritional foundations of the body through the methylation cycle. Then I look at pathogens and then environmental toxicity, and then finish up with working on nervous system issues and also the nerve fibers themselves and myelination and all these things, so that we rebuild the entire body from the ground up in a very sequenced, smart way. And no sequence is the same for 2 people. So, and I can have the same identical genetics, and sometimes the sequence is markedly different. But a person, I prefer genetic information and as much info as I can get, but I've gotten to where I can predict most of the genetic issues that I see. I've seen enough people now that I know what to look for. So if a person doesn't have that, or cost is precluding them from getting the 23andMe, it's not like I won't work with them, but it's to their advantage to have that. And I work, like I said, I work mostly with really chronically ill people, but I also am starting to now work with people to prevent and make sure that they don't go into these disease states. And like I said, children are becoming a big focus of my work because they're being inundated by so many sources of toxicity, from the improper light and the vaccination schedules and different things that can have negative health effects if the genetics aren't robust. And so that's kind of where I'm working, and that gets to the idea of preventative and optimizing medicine before there's problems. Because just to give you an economic statistic, usually chronic illnesses, something like MS, you're looking at a treatment cost through insurance of about $1 to $3 million over the course of the disease. And so what I like to say is that when you address your genetic weaknesses and you eat properly and you mind your P's and Q's of your body, I call it minting health millionaires, because you're literally putting money in your pocket over time, because these diseases are incredibly expensive to treat. So that's the idea, is that we keep that person's body functional into their 7th and 8th decades of life. And, it's not out of the question for people to get healthier over time when you fix your genetic problems.
Nice.
So there's probably more to say, but that's how a person would work with me. If anybody's interested, just to give a plug, you can send me an email at info@cosmicanimal.com, and that's cosmic with a K. And we can share, if there's show notes or something, you can share my contact information. My website's in the process of being rebooted, and we'll talk a lot more about my process of doing the genetic piece, and we'll show all my specialization areas around medicine, so people can easily reach out to me that way. But if a person has an issue, the first thing is get in touch with me, and we can talk about what we need to collate together in terms of data to work on it.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Ryan. I appreciate your time.
Thank you, Michael.
I've enjoyed the conversation, and having spoken to you before, I know we have a wide variety of other topics to talk about, but we'll stop for now, and I'll have you back on another time in the very near future.
Sounds great. I'd love to continue this conversation.
Awesome. Thanks, Ryan. Take care.
Have a wonderful day.
All right.
Bye-bye, Michael.